Did you know? Between 2000 and 2020, African countries have signed billions of loans from China in strategic economic areas. The value of the loans are in excess of $100 billion. 38 billion worth in 174 loans for energy projects. 46.6 billion worth in 274 loans in transport infrastructure. 15.3 billion worth in 141 loans for communications and national security purposes. When FOCAC was launched in 2000, China's investment stock in Africa was around 2%. By 2020, China's investments in transport infrastructure, energy, and telecommunications in Africa had jumped to 55%. With the majority of investors being state-owned companies. The Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, in conjunction with the Africa Institute for Environmental Law, brings to you the Political Economy Dialogues on Natural Resource Governance, PEDNAG. This is an ongoing series to raise awareness and advocate for the rights of communities and conservation of the environment and natural resources. Get ready to learn more about climate change, energy consumption, local service delivery governance, responsible investments, and so much more. Thank you for tuning in to today's episode.
My name is Josephine Chiname, and I'm from the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this edition of the PEDNAG Dialogue this afternoon. This edition of the PEDNAG Dialogue is running under the theme FOCAC 2021 Outlook, Positioning African Countries for Post-COVID Economic Recovery and Strong Partnership with China. We have been having a FOCAC PEDNAG discussion, for quite some time now, and today we are joined by a panel of experts. We have on the panel our Executive Director from ZELA, Mr. Mtuso Dliwayo. We also have the Executive Director of Southern Africa Resource Watch, SARWA, Dr. Kabemba. And we have another expert, Dr. Masamba, who is widely read and an expert on things to do with China, debt, and investments. So we are really in good hands. So to give a bit of background on the discussion today, and before I asked Dr. Masamba to come first and give a 20-minute presentation, I would like to just give a sort of background. We are talking about FOCAC. Some might not know or might want their memories be jogged on what we mean by FOCAC. So FOCAC is the forum, stands for the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, which was established in 2000 as a joint initiative between China and African countries. As of today, 53 African countries with diplomatic relations with China are now members of the FOCAC. And since 2012, the African Union has been a formal member of FOCAC. FOCAC has been an event where important issues surrounding the relationship between China and many African countries was discussed and decided upon. So as we are heading to FOCAC 2021, we saw it fit to convene a PEDNAG dialogue on this important aspect so that we are able to ventilate and able to, to discuss openly, as we did previously, on what are the policy options for different African countries. So without much further ado, I will call upon Dr. Masamba to give her presentation. Dr. Magali Masamba is a law and policy advisor who has worked with multilateral institutions, African governments, and the private sector. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Pretoria Center for Human Rights and Boston University's Global Development Policy Center. Her research interests are in global economic governance, debt, infrastructure, and climate change. And her PhD at the University of Pretoria focused on sovereign debt restructuring, human rights, and development in Africa. So today we are privileged to have Dr. Masamba, who will take us through a topic titled Taking Stock of FOCAC's Commitments, China-Africa Debt Diplomacy and Corporate Investments. Over to you, Dr. Masamba.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you so much for the great introduction, Josephine. As has been mentioned, my name is Dr. Magli Masamba, and I'm quite excited to be a panelist in today's session because we're talking about issues that are quite close to my heart, especially those that relate to debt. So thank you for the opportunity to participate in this workshop. For me, this will not be so much as a presentation, more of a discussion and an opportunity for me to share some of my thoughts and a bit of research I've done on the topic. Today, as we meet to share ideas on how Africa can prepare for economic recovery post-COVID-19, a major part of building back better, in my opinion, post the pandemic, definitely requires re-evaluating the continent's debt landscape. In addition to the debt landscape, I feel that another issue that we need to re-evaluate are the investments that have had debt implications on the continent, and inadvertently, as well as the strategic relationships that we have with international stakeholders. So in this presentation today, I will be looking at the FOCAC commitments, but specifically the aspect that I will be focusing on relates to the China-Africa debt diplomacy, as well the China-Africa debt diplomacy, as well as strengthening the relationship between the region and China. So in making my comments on this very interesting topic, I'll be doing four things. Firstly, I'll provide a little bit of a background as to why I think that the issue of China's investments in Africa and the issue of debt diplomacy and the implications of that are important or worth exploring. I'll look a little bit at FOCAC and some of the developments that have happened even as the forum is turning 21 this year. And thirdly, I'll discuss a bit about the continent's debt landscape and the implications of the China-Africa relationship. And finally, I'll provide some thoughts on how we can build back better after the pandemic, which is not only in terms of ensuring economic development, but also a stronger, healthier, and more equal relationship with China. So as a bit of background, and especially because my talk today will really focus on the debt issue, a starting point for me is always to acknowledge the fact that any discussion that relates to Africa's sovereign debt definitely requires mentioning some key considerations that should always feature in that discussion. The first one, in my opinion, is the issue of transparency in borrowing and lending and spending. The second one, the second interesting point that we should always consider is the issue of sound debt management. The third one is the need to reevaluate debt that the continent has already accrued, as well as the implications of some of the commitments that we have entered into. And here I'm really thinking about the need to really reevaluate some of the contractual provisions that we have signed. So, for instance, do some of the contracts that we have entered into potentially result in creditors taking over key assets or infrastructure in the event of default, for example? Are there options for restructuring? And finally, another important feature that I think should always form part of a discussion on the continent's debt is really about what approaches should we have to future borrowing that best reflects the interests of the continent. Now, these considerations, in my opinion, are quite integral and important, irrespective of the nature of the debt. So whether we're looking at debt from private creditors, bilateral creditors, or multilateral creditors. However, today, and in the wake of a very devastating pandemic, and as African countries are grappling with the health and economic implications of the COVID-19 pandemic, and even as the issue of servicing debt is raising very difficult questions, I think the toughest ones right now, the toughest two questions right now, first relate to, firstly, how do we deal with privately held debt? So how do we encourage private creditors to participate in restructuring and rescheduling initiatives? And the second one is, how do we deal with some of the newer non-Paris Club bilateral creditors? And this is where China comes in, because China is currently our main bilateral creditor. And surprisingly to me, this issue of China's debts to the continent, as well as some of the relationships that are either evident through the FOCAC or even through the Belt Road Initiative, are quite important. And I'll give an example. So in 2020, Zambia was the first African country to default on its bond debt. So in November of that year, the country defaulted on a coupon payment. I think it was approximately 42.5 million US dollar coupon payment. Now, in this instant, the private bondholders were unwilling to restructure, or to at least negotiate a restructuring for Zambia. And there are many reasons why they were unwilling, but one of the important one that stands out is that there was uncertainty on the treatment of Chinese debt. Or alternatively, there was a fear that if private bondholders agreed to a restructuring for Zambia, then that would inadvertently leave additional resources or free up additional resources for the servicing of Chinese debts. And most of these debts were linked to various projects. So as such, the issue of China-Africa relations, the issues of the projects that are current and other investments on the continent are, I think, one of the issues that quite a number of stakeholders are very interested in. So it's not only African citizens, African governments that are interested in this, but also different classes of creditors. So that relationship could have a very substantial impact on how the debt of the continent, even by other bilateral and even private creditors, is treated. Another reason why I think this conversation is very timely is the fact that this year the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is going to be 21 years old. And I think that this is definitely a good opportunity to reevaluate whether this relationship is an equitable one. So in my view, this relationship might be even more important than relationship with other international stakeholders. I was very surprised to learn when I was doing research for this discussion that there are more African heads of state that are attending, this forum, as opposed to, for instance, the United Nations General Assembly meetings. That's very surprising, and that tells you the fact that African countries are really placing importance to the China-Africa relationship. And I'll give an example. In 2018, for example, 51 African presidents attended the FOCAC summit. This is compared to 27 attending the United Nations General Assembly 2 weeks later. So that tells you so much about how important this relationship is to African governments, and the fact that as citizens of these countries, we do need to reevaluate or question whether this is a relationship, or at least the nature of the relationship right now, is one that benefits the continent. So let's delve into the three substantive areas of my discussion today, which is firstly, let's talk a little bit about the China-Africa relationship, and let's talk about the debt issue and possibly a couple of ideas of how to strengthen the relationship. So moving rapidly on in the year 2000, the Forum for China-Africa Cooperation first met in Beijing. It was hosted by the president of China, Xi Jinping, and 40 African heads of states attended. So before we delve a little bit more into the relationships, the commitments, the benefits, and what has happened since then, let's talk a little bit about the political economy dynamics that, in my view, resulted in this China-Africa relationship. And here, there's a couple of interesting things that was happening at the time. So in the late 1990s and the early 2000s. And I feel that one of the people that has most eloquently provided a synopsis of the political economy at this time is Guy Moore. I may be pronouncing his name wrong. But he observed that in the 1990s, or at least that decade, was a very tumultuous one for the continent. So during this decade, we had a number of wars. For instance, in Central Africa, the DRC. We had instability. That was the same decade that the Rwandan genocide happened. The HIV pandemic was ravaging. And also Africa's debt levels had reached such unsustainable levels, thus resulting in the heavily indebted poor country program and other multilateral, debt relief initiatives, by the World Bank, the IMF, and the Paris Club lenders. So during this time, I think it's quite important to observe or to note that Africa's relationship with the world was really one of a donor and a recipient. So Africa was not seen as an investment destination. It was not attracting much foreign direct investment and other forms of investment. Instead, the continent was, in my view, really seen as a good ground for pillaging, especially pillaging natural resources, if I can use such a strong word. And I'll give one example of the relationship between Africa and Western countries or companies. So I believe it was in about 2016 that there was a study conducted to reveal that 101 companies at the time that were listed on the London Stock Exchange, and these were mostly British companies, had up to 37 mining operations in sub-Saharan Africa. So according to this report, collectively, this amounted to almost a control of over $1 trillion. And this is $1 trillion worth control over, most of the most valuable natural resources on the continent. At the time, this report generated quite a lot of criticism in the media. And I did come across, one report, or at least one media report criticizing this. And what it said, I quote, the UK government has used its powers to influence and ensure that British mining companies have access to Africa's new renewable raw materials. And it also mentioned the fact that a lot of these ventures had very negative environmental, social, and human rights implications. So here now we have China stepping into the picture and presenting what may be seen as an alternative to, pillaging or just taking natural resources out. And it's presenting an option that goes beyond being just, a donor partner or a lender that has very tough conditionality. And instead, China seems to be proposing an option at the time of becoming an international investment partner. And in a way, it was offering what may be seen as more of a win-win situation as, opposed to the scenario that I've just described. So what did China want and what did Africa want at this time? So in my view, what China really wanted at the time was still access to natural resources at the source. However, this time, I believe that there was the option of the continent winning something. And for Africa, I guess, the win was much needed infrastructure development and other investments. So here we have a continent that is in much need of, infrastructure development, need of, for instance, roads, electricity, and is trying to open itself up to foreign direct investment. And you have a partner that is willing even to finance some of these these initiatives. But of course, raw materials still somehow played a very central role in this relationship. But if you look at the initial speeches during the first FOCAC forum, the Chinese president did describe the relationship as a partner, and in fact, as a partnership. And in fact, if you look at the most recent speech at the last forum, if I can quote what the president actually said, the Chinese president said, he said that China values sincerity, friendship, equality in pursuing cooperation. Now, over 1.3 billion Chinese people have been with over 1.2 billion African people in pursuing a shared future. We respect Africa. We love Africa and we support Africa. We follow a 5-no approach in our relationship with Africa. No interference in in African countries' pursuit for development paths that fit their national conditions. No interference in African countries' internal affairs. No imposition of our will on African countries. No attachment of political strings to assistance in Africa, and no seeking a selfish political gain in investment and financing cooperation in Africa. So if you listen to this speech, I'm sure that you can imagine why this relationship seemed and even seems quite attractive to African governments or to African presidents, heads of states and their governments, because it really presents the perspective of a cooperation, equal cooperation, equal partnership, no interference, fairness, and, equitability. Now, the question I guess we need to ask ourselves on, the 21st birthday of this forum and even this relationship is whether these are just words in a speech that, sound great on the international media, or whether on the ground this is actually the case. So let's look briefly at, FOCAC and how the relationship with Africa has evolved. And then maybe I can highlight, in my opinion, what some of the challenges still remain. So I'll give a couple of examples of how far the relationship between China, the government, and also Chinese companies has gone. So for instance, in the year 2000, at the time that this relationship started, there were less than 200 Chinese firms in Africa on the ground, operating on the continent. However, when you look at the year 2020, this went from less than 200 companies to approximately to more than, I think, 10,000 companies, of which of these approximately 10,000 companies, about a tenth are state-owned enterprises. And I guess the remainder are private companies. Now, also, when you look at the statistics provided online, and I realize that I haven't actually made a note of the source, but I can always provide a link if required. But as I did my research, I also was quite surprised to find that between the year 2000 and the year 2020, for example, the Chinese portfolio included approximately 46, not approximately, but 46 ports in sub-Saharan Africa. And that their investment also included 1/3 of the continent's power grid and energy infrastructure. This report that I saw also mentioned that there were that between this 20-year period, there were about 186 government buildings constructed. There were 14 intergovernmental telecommunications networks. And this is just a few examples of how much investment has occurred in the continent. However, one issue that arises, and I guess this is now linked to the second broad issue of debt diplomacy, is the fact that the reporting on all this, investment activity on the continent wasn't particularly clear on whether it was funded by foreign direct investment or debt financing. However, this document that I read on this mentioned the fact that during this 20-year period, African countries had actually signed 274 loans. And at the time, these loans were worth $46.6 billion US dollars for transport infrastructure alone, for example. So during this time as well, they signed 174 loans in the energy projects that were worth 38 billion and 141 loans in communications and national security worth 15.3 billion. And this is just 3 examples of sectors where quite substantial loans were concluded with China. Now, the issue of debt or the debt implications of China's investment on the continent, I think is really the elephant in the room. And in my view, is really one that should definitely be explored or discussed at the coming forum. When you look at the commitments and before I go deeper into the debt issue, I think one point that I probably should make now is there are definitely quite a number of different commitments that arise out of the FOCAC. However, one that I'll probably zoom into in the interest of time really relates to a commitment that arose at the last meeting, which was the establishment of some sort of a trade facilitation fund. And this $5 billion fund was a special fund that was specifically created to finance Chinese imports from Africa. And specifically, it's noted that this was to increase imports, particularly of non-resource products. However, when you look at what are the main, imports into China or exports out of Africa, you would find that these are mostly raw materials. You would find that China's main import partners in the continent are South Africa, Angola, Zambia, the Democratic Republic, and the Republic of Congo. And maybe if I exclude South Africa, most of these countries don't have a massive manufacturing capability. So they're definitely, exporting raw materials. So whether or not even this commitment, this fund to facilitate imports from Africa will be successful is both, is really dependent also on the manufacturing capability of the continent. So at this stage, I guess I've presented in a very brief manner the general landscape, the geopolitical and political economy landscape that maybe makes China a more interesting partner for the African continent? But also, I guess, maybe in your mind, the main question at this stage is whether this is actually a win-win relationship. Or even alternatively, we could say, who's winning more? Who's losing more? And what are we losing, or what is China winning, for example? So in response to this question, and really as we are at the 21st birthday of this forum, a few things come to my mind. So the first one is the fact that Africa is still exporting cheaper raw materials to China. And maybe the question is whether China is bleeding the continent of raw materials because, or whether really you can't really blame China. The issue is that Africa does not have a large scale manufacturing capability. And as we also speak about, the fourth industrial revolution, maybe we should re-explore our manufacturing capability.
Dr. Masamba.
Thank you. Yes.
You now need to wrap up. We are running out of time. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. 2 more minutes. At the same time, Africa is importing expensive finished products. And also, I've seen reports from the African Center of Strategic Studies that, some African firms are struggling to access China's value addition product markets. So really, the issue at this stage is whether this is, an equitable relationship, and what can we do moving forward. So as I conclude, I think that Africa needs to do what works, for the continent. Maybe one issue that I never discussed in detail was the issue of transparency. So in my view, the first thing that we would need is a more transparent relationship, and maybe these arrangements that have these kind of, secrecy clauses should be revisited. In addition to transparency, we need to have investments that really represent what we believe in, which I hope is, human rights, sustainable development, protecting the environment, and so forth. And that we really need to revisit our debt ceilings, our environmental and labor standards, public oversight, and also find ways to have better knowledge transfer. So really what I'm saying is that a stronger relationship with China means us re-evaluating our internal policies, our manufacturing capabilities, and really looking inwards on what's best for Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that detailed presentation and opener to our discussion. It was so very clear from your presentation that the relationship between China and Africa, as we are at the moment, is not going away, and we cannot wish it away. What we really need to do is to decide and make sure that whatever initiatives that we are doing are win-win for both Africa and China. Those who have questions, comments for Dr. Masamba, feel free to use the Q&A function as well as the chat function. We'll pick them up and have a response to those issues as we go. So now, before I bring in Dr. Kabemba to come in and make his presentation, from the presentation that we have just had, there was a question that was posed, there was a statement rather that was made by Dr. Masamba, that the relationship between China and Africa should be a relationship that reflects our values, reflects what Africa believes in. And with the advent of COVID-19, it has presented opportunities and vulnerabilities that the African continent can utilize to ensure that the relationship is a win-win. So to speak more about African values, African principles, we have Dr. Kabemba, whose topic is the role of Africa Union, the Africa Mining Vision, and regional initiatives in shaping Africa-China economic relations. So Dr. Kabemba is, I think I have mentioned this earlier when we started, that he is the Executive Director of Southern Africa Resource Watch, and he is an expert who closely follows Chinese investment operations in the investment sector in the SADC region. He has also co-authored a book titled Win-Win Partnerships, China, Southern Africa, and Extractive Industries. So I think some of the questions that were posed or that emerged from the presentation by Dr. Masamba will be able to glean more light, like what are the African values? What is it that we want to achieve as a continent? Is it achievable? From Dr. Kabemba's presentation. Dr. Kabemba, over to you.
Thank you so much, Josephine. I would like to also thank you, the Zela, for this kind invitation. I am very humbled to be here, and really, Dr. Masamba has laid out a strong foundation on which to build and discuss China-Africa relations. What I'm going to do, I'm going to simply share some reflections as we prepare for FOCA 21 in the midst of COVID-19. I want to suggest that COVID-19 is just not a pandemic. It is also a geopolitical issue that is being used in foreign policy and in trade. And the question that we are asking, does COVID-19 present an opportunity to build forward better? I know people, mostly I heard Dr. Masamba talking about building back better. I think building back better is dangerous for Africa. We want to build forward better. And I will try to be brief. My thoughts are not structured. I appreciate Dr. Masamba's thoughts were quite well structured. And there are many points she raises that comes also very strongly in what we are going to say, which suggests that the focus should be on Africa. What do we want from China? You remember that the emergence of China as the second most powerful nation created hope for Africa that it could escape the control of the West, which it has endured for centuries. There was a great expectation from both China and Africa that their relationship will be built on win-win, on justice, and non-interference. The fact that we see so many African head of state attending the Chinese summit, FOCA, it's exactly for this particular interest. Win-win relations with a second most powerful economy. So a number of African governments adopted a look east foreign policy to welcome China on the African continent. We opened our arms to welcome China. In doing so, it was not a gesture of an innocent gesture. It was also a recognition of the relationship we've had with the West, which has failed to take Africa out of its economic quagmires. However, few decades down the line, one of the critique of the rapprochement between China and Africa has been that China had a strategy to engage the continent. China knew exactly what it wanted, but Africa had no strategy, had only excitement. And this was supported by the unequal trade relationship and the sustainable debt of African countries towards China. So what we have seen throughout this decade is an unequal trade relation. Dr. Masamba correctly pointed out that it's very difficult for African goods, especially value-added goods, to enter China. The only things we enter China easily are African minerals. But what we've seen is also the accumulation of a sustainable debt of a number of African countries toward China. This is what Africa has gained after so many 2 or 3 decades. People will argue that indeed we've improved our infrastructure. Africa cannot continue to be in a situation where somebody needs to build our infrastructure. The problem with Africa is not lack of infrastructure, but the maintenance of that infrastructure. As China builds the infrastructure, it also destroys. It is destroyed as soon as it's built because we can't maintain the infrastructure. So the question is somewhere else. So it was clear at the time that Africa has missed once again an opportunity to position itself as a norm setter and not as a norm taker. Here, we have seen China dictating the relationship, using its financial muscles to find ways into Africa without a corresponding policy strategy from the African head of state government, the African Union, and regional organizations such as SADC. So what we have seen is that Africa, in rush and excitement on China's promises, has made the same mistakes we've made with the Western countries. We have repeated the same mistake of selling our raw materials cheaply, sometimes for nothing. The DRC out of state, President Tshisekedi wants to review Chinese mining contract because they've realized that we have not, as Africans, in this particular case, Congolese, benefited or gained sufficiently from those contracts. Infrastructure for minerals. Are we capable of, as Africans, to evaluate exactly who's benefiting optimally from those? So when COVID appeared, my thought were that this could be an opportunity for Africa to try to reposition itself vis-a-vis the outside world, including China, at least to reduce the dependence. Because here, the lockdown and travel restriction exposed Africa's dependence on outside world. The disruption of global supply chain exposed Africa's dependence on the outside. Even though most African governments classify the extractive industries, for example, mining, as essential service, Africa could not evacuate its commodity, its minerals, as fast as it could, pointing to the importance of intra-trade Africa. In fact, the fact that we were in lockdown and we could not sell our commodities as we should, and considering that Africa is the continent mostly with needs for development, industrialization, infrastructure building, that we cannot consume our minerals on the continent, was revealed, exposed. It also exposed the economic model in which Africa has been locked in. The fact that Africa produces what it cannot consume, it is problematic. And my thought were COVID was an opportunity for Africa to escape this type of model, where it trades with others and not with itself, and where it produces what it cannot consume. This model is problematic. We've used it for centuries. It has not helped us. Because COVID-19 has pushed us in isolation, where we started to see how can we depend on ourselves, because the rest of the world on which we depended on was locked down. Our leaders could have mobilized using that time, that window, to build some resilience on self-resilience. Those were my thoughts. So the dependence that COVID exposed was not just in terms of minerals, but it was also on consumable, as Africa experienced shortage of many goods, suggesting and exposing the low manufacturing capacity in the African continent. You could go in shops, there was nothing, including in South Africa, that we have not received a shipment from China, even for small things. That was so humiliating. And for me, I thought this is an opportunity for African leaders to say, how do we use the African free trade area, which we have launched? And here is COVID. That has put us to think about ourselves, how to build intra-trade. How can we ensure that together we create policies and strategies to ensure that post-COVID is about manufacturing on the African continent, is about intra-trade regime. But as we will see as I conclude that has not happened. In fact, talking about minerals, when China reopened trade after months of lockdowns, export of minerals from Africa increased drastically. These facts point to the persistent shift we have been observing in the past 2 decades, with Africa trading more and more with China than with its traditional partners, EU, the United States. In fact, let me make it that we cannot talk about China without talking about the United States and EU and Africa. Maybe another fact, as I reflect, we need to consider is that China worked hard to reduce very quickly to zero the threat of COVID-19 on its economy and people, which has allowed it to reopen its economy and take advantage of trade with other nations, especially with African continent. And what I've observed and I'm observing and learning is that China has continued to promote, attract, and increase trade with Africa. And in the meantime, Africa is struggling with COVID-19. So the opening of China's economy when Africa is struggling to deal with COVID-19 pandemic has seen increased in production in Africa to feed China. And this is problematic. We need to catch the nuance. Our economy is being eaten by COVID-19 and debt, but we are supplying China with our resources. And the solidarity win-win situation, a powerful Chinese economy has not shown that solidarity in pulling Africa up very quickly in dealing with COVID. We can then argue that China's high demand for commodities following the COVID recovery might seem to be good for Africa because of the increase in prices. But in reality, it is good for China because it's fueling its economic development and putting reserves in terms of minerals. So allow me then to argue, before COVID-19 could be equal to post-COVID-19 as far as China-Africa relations are concerned. So I'm becoming pessimistic that we are going to use COVID-19 as an opportunity to restructure our relationship with the rest of the world. We have not seen a more structured policy and approach from the AU. We have not seen from any African government, and we have not seen it from SADC and regional organization. So the problem with China-Africa relations is not whether China is buying cheaply Africa's product or not. The problem is whether Africa is drawing maximal benefits. And the answer is no. While we cannot dispute the interdependence between China and Africa, we can at least raise concern if this type of interdependence that Africa is in, especially in the work of COVID-19, is beneficial for the African continent. So the current interdependence, where Dr. Masamba referred to it, where we are selling our goods, we are getting revenues, simply reflect the structural deficiencies that were present before the COVID-19. It's an interdependence that undermines intra-trade Africa. Trade between China and Africa continues to expand the old model on which Africa trades in commodities and not in high value added goods. And that is problematic. So the point I am making is the following. Instead of COVID-19 being an opportunity for Africa to reconfigure its model of production and trade regime by pushing diversification as per African mining vision, Africa is sinking further down into its inability to change the colonial model of production that has condemned it as a producer of raw materials for other nations and consumer of manufacturing goods produced by others. In so doing, Africa is undermining the material conditions of its people by exporting jobs, revenues, and manufacturing. So Africa is failing, colleagues, to use opportunities offered by China's appetite for mineral resources to its advantage. Africa is failing to force China to add value to minerals before export on the continent. And I know it's possible with correct leadership at the national level, at the regional level, at the continental level, because most of Chinese companies that extract minerals on the continent are state-run companies. So there is a possibility to force those companies to add value and export finished good here to the rest of the world, because that's what China is doing. But we've seen China's manufacturing moving to other Asian countries as China tried to deal with its environmental problems. Why are we failing to attract those manufacturing Chinese companies on the African continent? So considering that COVID, it's because we seem to accept that COVID has not affected as much as it affected other continents. But colleagues, COVID is having a serious impact on our economies. So if Africa does not respond quickly to COVID-19, as you know, only 2% of African population has been vaccinated. So it will be very difficult. It's going to weaken the continent. So a weak continent ravaged by the pandemic will be a victim of exploitation. A weak Africa ravaged by COVID-19 will continue to seek handouts, as we've seen. We've already seen a decline in Chinese lending to Africa. The debt has increased, but the lending is decreasing, which started already in 2019. This trend will continue, and COVID-19 will expose Africa to further manipulation from external powers. So Africa could use the coming FOCAC, colleagues, as a barometer to look at the health of its relations with China and how it compares with traditional partners. Because the slogan of solidarity, of win-win partnership, or non-interference has not helped us much as we would have liked. In fact, a closer look of China's presence on the African continent, I'm quickly to conclude that it's not different from the Western approach. It is only interested in pursuit of its interest and helping Africa to get out of its bottom, at the bottom where it finds itself. The example of COVID vaccine is a proof. China is not making serious efforts to support Africa in its call for waiver of the international property rights. At FOCAC, I think Africa should force China to open up to Africa goods, as Dr. Masamba has argued. As for China, its strategy will not change, colleagues, although it must receive some adjustment. China's role in COVID-19 Africa remains about promoting solidarity, sending health products against COVID-19, which is not bad, is very good, and its strategy of further exploiting Africa's resources. It seems COVID-19 has created opportunities for China to cement its engagement with Africa through medical assistance, strengthening China's position on the continent. This is not surprising. In fact, when you look at the history of China relations and globally, Chinese strategy, global health, has always been an element of Chinese foreign policy, especially on the African continent. And China has realized that COVID can cement its solidarity with Africa and continue to see the excitement of African leaders wanting to be closer to China, but without pulling much of the benefits we wanted. So the Chinese solidarity is confronted by serious human rights in Chinese companies on the continent, especially in the extractive industry. There are very violent pictures that are emerging of Chinese mining owners using colonial violence and tactics to undermine and dehumanize African workers. Chinese companies are known for very bad labor practices. So COVID-19, colleagues, and debt are eating, as I say, away the socio-economic gains of the last decade, exposing Africa to handout and manipulation. It also forces African government into silence as China pillage the resources and undermine human rights. Chair, I'll finish there, I'll stop there, looking forward to some questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kabemba, for those reflections. Indeed, there seem not to be a regional strategy on China-Africa, despite the fact that we have been developing this relationship for years, and there is sort of an interdependence that is there. I like the fact that you have mentioned that as Africa, we cannot build back better, given that we were already failing in essence, but we should strive to build forward better. Those were very insightful presentations or submissions that you have made for us, and the fact that we seem to have more excitement about engaging with China and accepting Chinese investments in our continent, but we are failing also to put in place the systems, the structures that will make us prepare better for such kind of engagement or investments. The examples you have given of infrastructure, we are unable to maintain as a continent. We're very inspired. So now I think, as we were discussing, and also part of this PEDNAG dialogue was China-Africa relations, Africa-China relations, but we forget that Africa as a continent is not one country. Different countries have different approaches on how they are going to engage or how they are approaching their own development. So, and usually when we are talking of China-Africa relations, it's normally easier because China is one country. But when we are talking of Africa-China relations, it becomes more complicated as it is more multifaceted. So to unpack some of these issues, and also I think Dr. Masamba has managed to set a very good basis on some of these discussions. Is it a win-win situation? And Dr. Kabemba has given a regional presentational approach, and now to have a look at how Africa-China relations, but particularly looking at different countries, how different countries are approaching this kind of relationship. We have our director from the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, Mr. Mtuso Liwayo. He's going to speak on country strategy for engaging with China in the context of extractives and infrastructure development in Zimbabwe, Zambia, DRC, and South Africa. Mr. Liwayo has over 18 years of experience in working on natural resource governance and issues that relates to the democratization of Africa and its relation to natural resources. He was also one of the editors of our recently published handbook on China-Zimbabwe relations. Mr. Liwayo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Josephine, for that introduction, and good afternoon to you all, wherever you are joining us from. I think others may be joining us from Europe or from Asia and Africa as well. So my name is introduced by Josephine is Mtuso Liwayo, and I have just been asked to share my thoughts in terms of some of the country strategies that have actually been used by countries that are doing business with China, that includes Zimbabwe, South Africa, DRC, and Zambia, in terms of the extractive sector and also when it comes to infrastructure development, especially in light of the forthcoming 25th anniversary of the friendship of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, which will be held in Senegal this year. I think it is also important to really look at the history of FOCAC in terms of when it started, where was China and where was Africa? And now, where is China and where is Africa? And those that have spoken before me, that's Dr. Masamba and Dr. Kabemba, did a very good job. I think Dr. Masamba laid the foundation and Dr. Kabemba actually built the house. So I'm not very sure what I'm supposed to do here. Yeah, but let's start by looking at how China's position has grown, begin at the beginning of the relationship or partnership with Africa. Today, Africa is regarded as the biggest rival to the United States. That is in terms of the political, in terms of economical, in terms of military, in terms of cultural and also ideological issues. It is now regarded as the greatest threat. As I speak today, the United States, Britain, and Australia actually unveiled a strategy yesterday, basically to counter China. It shows how China has grown. But what has happened to Africa during that period? Has it also grown to become a major player or even at that level as a continent in terms of its economics, in terms of its politics, in terms of its military or even ideology? And the indicators point downwards. So, for example, Africa's trade deficit with China currently stands at $20 billion. And as people have pointed out, this is mainly because Africa continues to import finished and expensive products or goods from China, while it exports cheaper raw materials. And this is definitely not a mutual beneficial partnership, as what was envisaged at the beginning of this Forum on China-Africa Cooperation 21 years ago. So in its dealings with Africa, I think that has been pointed out that China has a strategy, and by implication, also in dealing with the different African countries, it may not be a strategy that is separate from that, but definitely that strategy is embedded in that overall China-Africa strategy in terms of how it deals with the continent itself and also how it deals with individual countries. So China does have a strategy. And the question that also arises, and that strategy helps us to get maximum benefits from its relationship with these African partners. And this has actually resulted in maximum benefits for it. So the question also is now that, do these African countries, let's begin at the continent itself, have a strategy to deal with China? And also as individuals, do they have any strategy to deal with China? I've chosen to do this analysis based on the 4 countries that I've already alluded to, and that is Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, and Zambia. And this is for a number of reasons. Firstly, they are all in Southern Africa, and Zimbabwe, Zambia, and South Africa actually share borders. Secondly, they all have significant and diverse mineral resource base, and also energy transition minerals and technological minerals, which are all critical in terms of this contribution or this discussion that we are having. Thirdly, all these countries have what is called a comprehensive strategic partnership or cooperation with China. So when China looks at these countries, it regards them as strategic partners of cooperation. And when I looked at the definition of what is a strategic cooperation or comprehensive strategic partnership of cooperation, it is defined as a situation where countries cooperate across a wide range of issues in highly sensitive areas and issues such as politics, diplomacy, as well as in economics and other less sensitive areas. And when you look at what a partnership is all about, it entails partners remaining independent. Of course, they can work together, collaborate, but they remain independent. I think the issues of sovereignty that have been outlined, and this is one of the things that attracted Africa to this partnership with China, shares the benefits from the risks in the partnership, then control over joint ownership or actions, then make ongoing contributions in strategic areas. So the question now is, if these partnerships is supposed to be comprehensive, who is benefiting, who is winning? I think the conversation that has already happened shows that there's definitely one partner there that is benefiting and that is winning, and while the others are actually losing out. But what are the opportunities that are there for them to leverage in terms of strategy? First and foremost, we have the continent, the continental level, and there are levers or angles there through which countries can actually build on. And these levers include the African Union's Agenda 2063 and also the African Mining Vision. And even when you come to the regional level, as I said, these are at SADC. There's also the Southern Africa Barometer Principles, which Dr. Kabemba actually and his organization actually worked on in partnership with other organizations that include ZELA. But there's also the SADC Protocol on mining. And all these are levers that are there that can actually help the countries, these 4 countries, in developing and strengthening their strategies. One may say some of these strategies at that level are weak, but as I said, they provide a foundation. So when I look at the African Union's the Agenda 2063 Aspiration 1, it calls for a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development. And definitely the mining and energy sectors can definitely contribute towards this aspiration without a doubt. And also look at the African Mining Vision. In this vision, it calls for transparent, equitable, and optimal exploitation of mineral resources to underpin broad-based sustainable growth and socioeconomic development. Again, this offers a very good opportunity. So when I look at Zimbabwe, for example, it has a number of policy documents that can be regarded as part and parcel of those strategies to make sure that it derives maximum benefits from its partnership with China in terms of these issues. So first and foremost, we have what is called the Vision 2030. We also have what is called the National Development Strategy 1 and the US 12 billion mining economy strategy. And all these, when you look at them closely, they speak about the centrality of the extractive sector in terms of making sure that Zimbabwe recovers from its current economic challenges and probably stabilize and also position it for eventual growth. And there are elements that can actually be used in terms of developing a strategy. But not only that, you look at the Constitution itself, it also has provisions that can actually be helpful, especially when you look at Section 315, subsection 2, in terms of the need for transparency and accountability in terms of how these contracts are negotiated, including those that relate to mineral concessions. So one could say that there's a very strong basis there for them to build on as a country. But whether this has been developed, that's something else. It hasn't been. Because for me, those are the basics that can actually be used to develop a more coherent strategy that can now be used in terms of engaging with China to make sure that that so-called strategic partnership indeed becomes very strategic. That has not happened at the moment. When I look at South Africa, they have what is called the National Development Plan 2030, Our Future, Make It Work. Again, very sound there. And again, the extractive sector plays a critical role in terms of making sure that this vision is achieved. Again, it provides those bases that are there that can actually be used to make sure that South Africa comes up with a comprehensive strategy. I know that there was a meeting that was held in 2019 where at the continental level, there were plans to begin to put something that resembles of a strategy that Africa can use in terms of engaging. And that meeting was actually held in South Africa. And South African think tanks are basically leading in terms of developing what can actually be come up as a strategy that African countries can borrow from in terms of strengthening their own strategies at the national level, but also collectively at that level use in terms of engaging China to make sure that there are benefits that can arise from this partnership. Because we want that partnership to work for all of us, or to make sure that that partnership is indeed beneficial, is indeed resulting in win-win, unlike at the moment where it is basically in favor of China. China is definitely winning without a shadow of a doubt. When you look at the statistics that are out there, that shows how it has grown economically and all those other indicators, but the same cannot be said of Africa. DRC also has a strategy, And we have Dr. Kabemba here from DRC, and he has written widely in terms of some of the issues and the problems that are there that are affecting the realization of that strategy to make sure that DRC, with its significant mineral resource base, can actually maximize that to make sure that it develops economically and also ensure that it benefits from its partnership with China. I think DRC is one of those countries that has got a long history of association with China, beginning from the 1960s. Zambia also has an investment strategy, again, that has got elements that could actually be turned into a strategy to make sure that they engage China in a more fair and equitable way to make sure that they also derive benefits. But when I look at those strategies, some of them which look very good in terms of the paper, I saw some fundamental problems there in terms of how this can actually be turned into something that unlocks value for these 4 countries. That is Zimbabwe, Zambia, South Africa, and the DRC. One of the reasons why China has succeeded is because of leadership. Leadership that is able to build the state, to have capacity, and be able to come up with a clear vision, and using that clear vision to make sure that it gets what it wants. But when I looked at some of our leaders within the region, we see weak leadership. We see people that are even at times struggling in terms of their own legitimacy. So when Dr. Masamba says these African governments prefer to go to attend the FOCAC meeting rather than the UN General Assembly, they're not doing that for the benefit of the citizens or for the benefit or the development of the country itself. They're basically doing that to strengthen their own political power and also get benefits. And that's the major difference, because when Chinese leaders are advancing that vision, they're mainly guided by national interests and not by personal interests. But maybe they are also different because maybe they're not facing those same challenges in terms of their legitimacy compared to countries that are in the region. So you take, for example, Zimbabwe, disputed outcomes of elections. So when someone like that negotiates with China, all they're mainly interested is make sure that they are strengthening their political power. And this is also reflected even in some of the priorities. So while others may be prioritizing infrastructure, whatever it is, at times we see some leaders prioritizing a defense college, because for them, maybe it is linked to their ability to retain power and make sure that they are able to rule. So I think for me, that's the difference in terms of the leadership and also the challenges that that leadership sees as threatening their power, and in return, what that does in terms of making sure that they prioritize things. Again, the same can be said in terms of the DRC with all the political turmoil that has happened there. So I think most of those leaders, when they negotiate with China in terms of these deals, for them, it's meant to strengthen their political power. So given that fact, China sees advantage in that. So China is not really attempted to build the capacity of the state when you go to the DRC or even Zimbabwe for that matter. And why should it be? I mean, let's also be fair here. China is looking after its own interests, and so on should. The same applies to us as Africans. So it should not be the responsibility of China to make sure that it builds the state capacity of Zimbabwe or DRC. I think it is the responsibility of our own leaders as well to make sure that we build that capacity for our own interests. So everyone has got interest. China has got its own interest, and it's justified to pursue its own interests. And the same should also motivate us as Africans to pursue our own interests with equal zeal, just like the Chinese do. So the fact that we have not benefited, I would not want to blame it on China, because if we do that, yesterday it was the West and we blamed the West. Today it's China and we are blaming China. Tomorrow it could be the Brazilians, it could be the South Africans. And we end up blaming people instead of blaming ourselves to say, what do we need to do? So for me, research in terms of the answers and the challenges should be very much inward looking. What do we need to do? And one of those things that we need to correct as Africans is basically the leadership. We need to really address that to make sure that we begin to benefit. I've also done a comparative analysis, and it seems to emerge that when it comes to negotiations, which is very important, and again, that is linked to state capacity, negotiating deals to make sure that they unlock value, it appears as if those that are in East Africa are able to negotiate better than us. Of course, as we always say, that there's nothing better or greater except in comparison. So maybe when I compare Southern African countries compared to those that are in East Africa, I think they seem to be doing better. if we see how the likes of Ethiopia has been able to negotiate some of those deals, the likes of Kenya as well, and even when you look at Rwanda, the way how they've engaged and negotiated with China, they seem to be getting better deals. Of course, those deals could be much better than that, but at least compared to those countries that in Southern Africa, I think I seem to see a difference there. I was looking at one of the deals that was negotiated between Ethiopia and China in terms of the building of the railway line in Ethiopia, the one that links it from Ethiopia to the port of Djibouti, and the 756-kilometer railway line. And during the negotiations, Ethiopia insisted on technology transfer and the building of competent labor force as part of its negotiations with China Railway Group. And this actually resulted in technology transfer and also the building of capacity and skills and the training of some of these engineers, and also the support to what is called the African Railway Center for Excellence, which is a regional institute that trains railway engineers, including offering them training facilities or opportunities at master's and even PhD level. Again, that's evidence of someone that is able to negotiate in terms of the knowledge itself. It's also the technology transfer. And that's not what's happening in most African countries, Zimbabwe included. So that's why I said in terms of negotiations, East Africa seems to be doing much better than us. And I think the same can also be said, as I said, in terms of Kenya. It has its own challenges, but again, when you compare. But apart from that, this idea of negotiating better, I think there's also a need for greater transparency in terms of how these deals are negotiated. And again, that's one of the biggest problems that we have seen, that mostly because they are meant to benefit individuals or those that are connected, these are done in secrecy and no one really knows what is there. And this has resulted in problems. So one of the problems that we have is that as a lack of transparency, this has tended to antagonize relationships that are there or that should exist between the people of Africa generally and also the people of China, because all we see is those problems that are there. But maybe, who knows, if there was greater transparency in terms of understanding what these deals entail and also the involvement of other stakeholders, I think that could actually be helpful. And that is something that we need to really build on, to take everyone on board in terms of these negotiations, knowing that they are not just meant to benefit those politicians only, but the public, the general public. So there's need to open up in terms of how these deals are negotiated. But maybe what is also needed is basically to build the capacity of the private sector. Maybe the opportunities are there. Maybe our private sector is not able to negotiate better. Maybe the private sector is used to negotiating with Western investors and they're failing in terms of engaging the Chinese investors and also maximizing benefits. So there's also need to build capacity at that level in terms of the private sector so that they're able to understand what does China mean in terms of opportunity? What does China mean in terms of challenges? And what do we need to do? If it means investment in that, then let it be. But I think the private sector could actually play a very critical role in terms of those opportunities. But it also has to be equipped to make sure that they are able to engage and negotiate better. And I think what also needs to be done in some instances is that renegotiation of contracts. I'm glad that DRC is already doing that. I think that gives hope, whether it is going to be successful or not. But that thinking to say that these deals are unfair and equitable, for me, in itself also gives hope to say, look, China should begin to realize that they can't always get away with these poorly negotiated deals because of lack of state capacity. And there are changes, as we have seen in the DRC, things may also be able to change. So for me, that is also very important in terms of making sure that we improve our capacity. Private sector, so NGOs, civil society organizations also need to play their part. So when you say NGOs or civil society, it's not just this criticism only, but are we also able to provide capacity? Let's say we are asked to say by the government of Zimbabwe or the government of South Africa to say, help us to engage Chinese investors, help us negotiate. Are we able to do that? So it also means that we need to sharpen our skills as well as society organizations to make sure that we are able to provide that support when it is needed. I know today that a number of organizations that are working in the sector can actually provide technical support when it comes to dealing with Western investors. But can we also do that when it comes to Chinese investors? maybe not. So that's something that we also need to reflect on as society organizations. And of course, the other strategies that we use in terms of litigation, those also have to be scaled up. I was reading a Kenyan case in terms of the standard gauge railway that was built by the Chinese, and one of the contracts ended up being terminated after some civil society organizations went to court to challenge the way how it was negotiated. And the court declared that it was being cancelled because the contract was not negotiated through a fair, transparent, equitable, and competitive and cost-effective process. So that's a strategy that can actually help. And of course, the media also needs to play their part. But I think capacity is important in terms of these stakeholders, in terms of engaging China to make sure that we all benefit. So it's not just blaming the state on, I think we all also have a role to play as society organizations. And one would say, what are we doing? So I think I'll end with that question to say, let's also reflect as society organizations, the part that we are playing, the part that we can play to make sure that it's not just the states only that are tackling Chinese investments, but all of us, so that we are able to benefit from these so-called mutual partnerships that are there between our states and the Chinese government. Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you so much, Muthuso. You have raised important and critical points, which we will visit as the discussion goes on. For now, I would like Dr. Kabemba to react to some of the questions that have been addressed to him. We have Cosmas Sunguro, who has written that, Mr. Kabemba, you talked about supply of COVID vaccinations by China as another way we continue to sink in debts. What do you suggest we do as Africans to move away from this quagmire? And we have another comment which says that, great presentation, Dr. Kabemba. Indeed, China is looking for its own interest. Great submission. Key question is, how do we rebuild the African agency at the regional and continental level with such challenges Dr. Masamba highlighted on Africa valued added products failing to find a way into Chinese markets? What can Africa leverage on to alter trade relations with China, Dr. Kabemba? I think those are the direct questions to you. And lastly, I think there is another one which says, what is the cure, Dr. Kabemba and Muthuso, to the leadership vacuum? Narrative more is on the entrepreneurial state. Do we have that in Africa? Can we emulate Rwanda, a state with capacity to engage in business transactions with investors of different origins? So, Dr. Kabemba, I will give you time to react to those questions and comments before you can leave us. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Those are quite good questions. My reply to the supply of COVID-19 and debt, I made a point that China supplying COVID-19 vaccine to Africa, masks, and testing kits are important. It also demonstrates the solidarity that China speaks about. And when you compare China supply and involvement in COVID in Africa, it's far above what the Western countries, Europe and America put together. China has done tremendously well to come to the rescue of the continent, a continent that has not invested in education and scientific research, a continent that is not investing in its universities, a continent that is not investing in science and technology and mathematics. That's the problem we have. Now, when they have given you this support, even if it's for free, you have a moral debt toward that. And that will be used in the negotiations. They will remind you of how we've come to your rescue, of how we have supported you. Can you look aside on these particular issues? Can African governments that are receiving this aid will have the capacity to engage in open, transparent negotiation with China in the interest of their people? I don't know. So the question is, how do we ensure that solidarity does not undermine equal partnership, whether in the trade or in any type of investment on the continent? The issues raised by Mutuso and Dr. Masamba around transparency and accountability, around trade contract negotiations are important, because we run into debt, because we are convinced by others that by doing certain things it will solve our problems. And that's why Zambia went wrong under the previous government, because they were excited with the magnitude of the capacity of China. They forgot that China will ask them to pay, and pay very quickly. And China has done that so. And the calls for China to forgive, to have debt forgiveness has not happened. China has been quiet on that. How do we build African agencies? Look, it's about Africa, China, it's about power relations. And we cannot also discuss Africa as one monolithic, coherent continent. Africa is a combination of 54 countries, which are quite different in terms of leadership, in terms of development programs and interests, in terms of priorities and definition of those priorities. So last week on this platform, I discussed the issue of whether we engage China as a unit, or we allow countries individually to build their capacity to engage China, just as each country engage the EU or engage the United States, Australia, Canada, Turkey, and so on, Russia and India. It's the capacity of these states individually that will reflect the image of the AU. The AU is a reflection. The weakness we see at the continental level, at the AU, is a reflection of the weaknesses of the state that compose it. So for me, the issue of leadership, all three of us have raised, is critical. But leadership on its own is not sufficient, just as Rwanda of President Kagame has shown. What President Kagame has done is to rebuild the state, is to rebuild the capacity of the state. Each institution of the state is functioning following a protocol that has been set, both in terms of human capacity to run those ministries, departments, agencies, in terms of infrastructure provided for those agencies. In fact, in terms of technology that has been provided. When you go to most of these Rwandan agencies that manages, you go to the Ministry of Mines, you can see that these people understand what they want to achieve with mining. When you go to one of our ministries in Southern Africa, with the exception maybe of South Africa and Namibia and Botswana, you'll be surprised. In fact, you are going to say we should not be doing mining because we are not ready, because our ministries are not equipped. When you want to go and monitor a Chinese company or any companies, which is at 150 kilometers away from the capital where you are, you want to jump into a private plane of the mining company, or you want to ask for petrol. So it is terribly. The institutional capacity is just not there. We've done very well in terms of policy, legislation, regulations, but we don't have the state to manage our affairs. So the cure for me is exactly that. I'm a proponent of building the state. I don't think Africa can emerge from this situation with weak states. Some states don't even exist. They exist because police ransom the citizens, police because of some state agencies exist because of corruption. So we need to reflect on that as we rebuild, as we go to meet either the Chinese or the Americans. They understand that we have not built the foundation. The foundation is empty. That's why you'll find in countries, including where Chinese companies, illegal Chinese operations are taking place. And nobody knows whether you'll find they are in cahoots with politicians. So we have a much bigger problem, and I agree with Mutuso. We cannot simply blame the Chinese. While the problem, the bigger problem is internal, and we have to resolve that. As long as we have not taken cognizance of this, we can fight about human rights, we can fight about transparency, we can do whatever we want. As long as the state is unable to protect itself, we are doomed. Because when the state is weak, it reflects the weakness of the leadership. You can't have a correct leader with a weak state. I think it's a contradiction. That's why we have Kagame, who has been reflected and positioned as a leader, strong leader. Rwanda is a strong state. That's why Rwanda is sending its army to fight in Central Republic and beat the French. The French get shy because they've been beaten by the Rwandese. They say, no, it was the Russian. And Macron is to negotiate with President Kagame to allow the French soldiers to exit. That's why Kagame sent soldiers to Mozambique. And they've cleaned there. They've done a great job, whatever people can say, because the state is functional. You can't have a functional army without a state. It's not possible. Because when Zimbabwe sent its army in the Congo to support Laurent Kabila, the Zimbabwean state was already in decay. While the Zimbabwe army was one of the strongest on the continent, but because of the corruption, they end up into corruption and doing businesses and trade and so on. And they become millionaires. So they brought that into Zimbabwe, and nothing can work in Zimbabwe because the army itself has been paralyzed. So I'll stop there, Chair, in terms of my submission.
Before you leave, Mutuso has something that he wants to pose to you quickly and a short interjection. Mutuso, yes. Go ahead.
When you look at the example that he has given, Kagame in Rwanda, and also when you look at China itself, so is there a correlationship in terms of leadership and some sort of dictatorship? Because in China, they don't have elections. And even Kagame, with all those that good that is coming from there, that has enabled him to build a strong state. But there are those allegations that he's a dictator. Even the opposition does not exist. So what can we learn from there in terms of that ability to build the state, but also at times compromising on some of those so-called tenets of democracy? Is there a linkage there, Dr. Kabemba, when you look at Rwanda itself and also China itself that we are trying to engage? Is there that linkage? Is there something that we can also learn from those examples? Thank you.
I'll reply by using Zimbabwe's case. If you ask Zimbabweans today that do they want bread milk, mealie meal, meat, clean schools, education, health, or do they want democracy? My gut feeling is that people will choose good life, will choose social transformation for themselves and their children. Hear me well. I'm not arguing that human rights are a problem. Human rights should be supported and accepted. I'm simply saying we cannot spend too much on democracy when our people are dying with hunger and so on. How can we find a system that both balance provision on the social front and a political system that protects everybody? In China, when you study, there are different systems of management of the state. When you go at the local level, Mutuso, you'll find that there is serious democracy there. The selection of local leaders is democratic. As you go up, you find a unitary state controlled by a party that does not accept nonsense. It's true there is a fear of the state, but when you ask most Chinese today, they are enjoying China. They are enjoying the power of China. Most of them, they'll tell you we are happy, despite the criticism. So I'm putting it to you. They come, they say, we'll give you bread, a hospital, clean and everything. And we have somebody who appears to be a dictator. What are you going to choose? It's like choosing between war no. So I'm raising this simply. I think it's a difficult question, but I'm raising it to say democracy cannot be too expensive. We need to be more developmental. If a system is working for China, and which has worked, because look, China today will be producing more engineers, produces in fact more engineers and more mathematicians and so on in the science than the United States. After 3 people who are finishing, in fact, in those specialized in STEM are Chinese. So you are not going to be surprised to see China doing what they are doing. It's because the state is investing in the people. We can't then say this is yes, we can criticize them, but is China a better place today than in many other countries? China will have more billionaires soon than any country. China has brought every year 300,000 people out of poverty for the past 2 decades. So I'll rest it there, Mutuso. Thank you so much. That's a difficult question, and I think we are sensitive. We have got difficulties as Africans, especially civil society, to confront that question truly and surely. That we are not saying democracy is bad, but we are saying if something works, can we give it a chance? Kagame will not live forever. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Kabemba. Thank you for those reactions, and thank you for, allowing us to keep you. Thank you so much for this engagement. There is a question for Dr. Masamba here. It says, you have referred to the need to promote transparent relationship between China and Africa. Can this relationship be leveraged given the investment protocol that is being developed under the new trade agreement?
Thank you. I've seen the question on the chat. So maybe what I can say as a starting point is not just a transparent relationship, but each and every transaction needs to be transparent. So remember, flowing from the broad relationship with China, there's thousands of contracts that are being signed all over the continent. And as Dr. Kavemba noted, we're talking about, more than 50 different countries that have their own negotiating style and have their own interests. So when it comes to the Continental Free Trade Area and specifically the investment protocol, I believe that the protocol will only be as useful as it is implemented. So to me, the Continental Free Trade Area will only be as successful as how well it is implemented. Beyond that, it's going to be a piece of paper. So like any other regional agreement, it requires each country to incorporate the tenets of the protocol into how they negotiate specific or individual projects. So specific and individual projects. So I'll give an example. So for example, in the mining sector, African countries have been providing Chinese mining operations with quite a lot of concessions, such as Zimbabwe allowing the Chinese to mine in the Hwange National Park. You have concessions given by the DRC and so forth. You also have illegal agreements. I believe it might have been Mr. Mtuso that mentioned the Kenya standard gauge rail project that was challenged by civil society organization, and that was found by the courts to have been an illegal contract. So at the end of the day, having a regional agreement or regional document will only help if that regional document is actually implemented at a national level. So at the end of the day, African countries need to decide how they want to negotiate, what they want to negotiate, and how they want their contracts and agreements to look, and how public those agreements should be. So I'll answer like any other lawyer would, with the answer being, it depends. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Masamba. It's with regards to loans. It reads, Dr. Masamba, the loan agreements, has the African private sector benefited? Has there been tech knowledge transfer with the likes of Huawei? Does FOCAC provide a space for the Africa private sector? I think Mtuso in his presentation partly answered some of a part of this question, but would like to hear your reflections, Doctor. Mtuso gave an example of the Ethiopian railway. So would like to hear more examples, if there are any, which other African countries can emulate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that question. It's a complex one to say in either a yes or no whether the African private sector has benefited from this arrangement. But I'll start off by talking about capacity development. So as part of the FOCAC, there is a capacity development component. If I'm not mistaken, in the last session of the forum, I think there were about 50,000 spaces open to capacity development, but I would have to double check that. However, I think the question relates more to capacity development in the context of all these individual projects that include, Chinese investors. And again, the response is really, it depends. And what does it depend on? It actually depends on what you've negotiated and how well you've negotiated. So going back to what Mr. Mtuso mentioned about the Ethiopian deal, if you request for, knowledge transfer, capacity development to be part of a project contract, then obviously you would say that there is some sort of, benefit. But in general, with a lot of these projects, you'd find that, for instance, in the infrastructure space, a lot of them might be financed by the Chinese, but also constructed by the Chinese. And dependent on how relaxed the labor laws in a certain country are, you can always have instances also where a large part of the labor comes from China, including even low-skill labor. So in that instance, we end up with, infrastructure, but was there capacity development, knowledge transfer? No. So it really depends on the individual contracts. And I think the Ethiopian example and how successful that they were in negotiating such an important term is one good example. I'm sure that there are many. We'd have to look at the individual projects to see what the contracts say. A lot of the time, these contracts are subject to confidentiality clauses. So it's not always easy to make that assessment in terms of the contractual provisions and how they're actually implemented. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that response. And the last question that I would like you to respond to, Doctor, is a question regarding state capture. The question reads, can we say the African state, together with its continental governance architecture, is captured by China, just as it was captured by the Western interest? Question is, how do we free the state from that capture so that the preoccupation of the state is the African citizen? Dr. Masamba, are you still there?
Yes, I am. Being a lawyer, I'll start off with, how slightly uncomfortable I am with the use of the term state capture to describe the relationship between China and Africa. I haven't done much research on state capture myself, but from my understanding, it really involves an element of, political corruption. Whether or not there are individual projects that have been grappled with actual corruption requires an assessment of each and every project. For instance, we mentioned the Standard Rail project in Kenya and a few other projects, and even loan agreements that didn't meet conditions or requirements in loan in financial management acts, or didn't receive the right approvals. So I'll use the word capture in terms of the dictionary definition. And maybe I'm playing it safe, as a lawyer. So is Africa being captured, by China? And by capture, again, I use the ordinary meaning. And really the question here is, whose interest is China considering in the relationship with Africa? And obviously it will be Chinese interests. In the same way, African countries have the responsibility to safeguard their own interests. I think that when we look at the political economy environment, as Africa, we really underestimate how important or powerful we are as a partner. And I think that's where the issue also relies. So not only do these kind of relationships relate to natural resources, but there are also geopolitical reasons why China would want to be a partner with 54, 55 countries, even when geopolitical issues arise, like issues to do with, Taiwan and so forth, these issues that are not necessarily economic. So if African countries go into negotiations with the understanding that we are strategic partners, that we do have leverage and that we can negotiate, maybe then we wouldn't say that we're being captured. That statement implies victimhood, implies that, again, we are unable to take care or protect our own interests. I think it speaks back to the issue of governance and leadership, and whether our leaders actually have our best interests at heart. I'll stop there on this question, but happy to further it if there's any point that's unclear or if there's any other questions.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Masamba. I'm sure political analysts will be able to venture more into the state capture question that has been posed, but I think you have managed to give very good reflections on that aspect. So I think we are over our time, but I would quickly ask Muthuso to just answer one of the questions that have been asked in the chat. It's with regards to which state is better. Should we rebuild African relations with the West as opposed to working with China? Can we connect with the West better, or is the track record of Western companies or Western investors better than that of China? I think that's the gist of the comment that was referred to you. And once you are done, Muthuso, you can give us your final remarks, and I'll also give Dr. Masamba an opportunity to give her final remarks. Unfortunately, we are not able to go through all the questions that have been posed to us, but I'm sure we'll be able to develop them and give reflections as we continue with the PEDNAG dialogue series. Muthuso, can you respond to that question? Sure. Your final remarks? Thank you.
For me, the entry of China gives us an opportunity. We always say the more the merrier, the more the merrier, the better. So the entry of China should give us an opportunity in terms of negotiating better to say, look, we had one dominant player, the West, and we had no options. But here's another opportunity or another option that is there. So I see the entry of China as being advantageous, to be honest. Or theoretically, it should actually give us more options, more opportunities, rather than being a problem. The fact that we are failing to utilize that should not blind us to that opportunity that it offers, because this should actually result in more competition to say, oh, you China, you can't give us this, we can go to the West. You, the West, you are doing this, we can go to China. And that should actually give us a bargaining point to get better deals and make sure that these relationships are more fair and equitable. But we are failing even with that. So I think for me, as I said, it will be less thinking, to be honest, to begin to think that China is the problem or even the West is the problem. Because when you look at the West, if indeed benevolent to us, I mean, after all those years of colonialism, hundreds of years, why haven't we developed? Why are we still having those challenges? China is actually a new entry, to be honest, for the past 20 years or so. When you look at FOCAC, that's just 20 years. So I think let's not blame others for our failure to do better, or for our failure to engage and to negotiate, whether it is with China, whether it is with the West. I think for me, the fact that there are those powers that have those geopolitical interests that are vying for what we have, which is our natural resources, our mineral resources, that should, in essence, give us more opportunities to negotiate better. The fact that we are failing, I think, should not make us blind to that opportunity. So let's take it as an opportunity and say, look, what do we need to do better to make sure that we are able to negotiate? So for me, it's not a binary discussion to say, is it China or is it the West? We need both, to be honest. But not only that, even the West itself, has they moved out because the Chinese companies have come to Zimbabwe? They're still there. They're also competing. So I think that's why we should also view it as an opportunity to negotiate better from those people that are, or those investors that have got interest in terms of our resources, and then make sure that we get better deals. I think for me, that should be the essence. Yeah. So in terms of my final remarks, I think this conversation is very important. We are all learning. It's a new subject that we are all trying to grapple with, to understand. And the participation of experts like Dr. Kabemba, like Dr. Masamba, it does help us to understand these issues better. And I also take it as part of capacity building for us as society organizations, because at times we talk about these issues out of conjecture without really understanding. And the presence of experts like this helps us to have a more detailed understanding or a more comprehensive understanding of the issues. And this should also prepare us in terms of our negotiations, in terms of our capacity building with the relevant stakeholders. And also, whenever the opportunity arises for us to advise, we should also be able to do that. Yeah. So yeah, I really thank the the panelists that spoke before me and the issues that they were able to bring. And I think this is a space that should continue to inspire us all in terms of those people that are working on Chinese investments. So those are my closing remarks, Josephine. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mutuso, for those reflections. I'll give the time to Dr. Masamba to share your closing remarks, observations, or parting shot with the attendees.
Thank you very much for that. I think that my closing remarks really may echo Mutuso's remarks, because in closing, we do have to acknowledge that we need partners. Africa cannot go it alone. However, we need to create a strategy with how we engage with those partners, and building forward better, which is the new phrase that we're going to be using, requires re-evaluating our role in the global economy. African countries are not victims, they're not the weaker party, and we do have cards that we can play at the negotiating table. And maybe what this requires is, capacity development on negotiating, making use of, technical staff in how we engage, with these different parties, pushing some of these issues that are important to us, such as transparency, investments that don't damage the environment, but that rather promote sustainable development, issues on human rights and governance and social and even environmental safeguards. So I think that, we can conclude the session in a positive way by saying that there is hope, and that it's really up to us to engage better and to do better. And hopefully civil society organizations will find their place in pushing governments to do better. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those reflections. And with those remarks, colleagues, we have reached the end of our dialogue series. Let's continue to converse, to discuss around Chinese investments in Africa until we can push our governments, push our policymakers to find solutions. These dialogues are created for us to find policy options, to try and find solutions on matters that relates to issues surrounding natural resource governance. So we hope for a better future, a better Africa. And once again, I would like to reiterate that as an organization, as ZELA, as Africa Institute for Environmental Law, we are not opposed to investments. We are not particularly opposed to Chinese investments, but we would like to promote responsible investments that result in broad-based economic development for the majority and for our country. So thank you. Until next time, bye-bye.
That was one of the political economy dialogues on natural resource governance, PEDNAG, brought to you by the Zimbabwe Environmental Law Association, ZELA, and the Africa Institute for Environmental Law. For more information, please check out www.zela.org or follow the African Institute for Environmental Law on Twitter at AIEL_info. Stay tuned for more episodes.